Today at the National Press Club, the Director-General of the National Archives of Australia, David Fricker, taking on the role in 2012, he's been leading the transition to digital archives. Before that, he worked on major government projects from defence to intelligence. David Fricker with today's National Press Club address.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the National Press Club here in Canberra and today's Westpac address. My name is Laura Tingle. I'm the club's president. Today's guest is David Fricker, the Director-General of one of Australia's most important cultural and historical institutions, the National Archives of Australia. It's been facing its own existential crisis of late and found itself embroiled in some right royal controversies. So please join me in welcoming him for what will no doubt be a most fascinating address.
Well, thank you very much, Laura, for that introduction. Thank you also to the National Press Club for this opportunity to speak briefly about the National Archives of Australia. This year we commemorate our 60th anniversary since we became a separate institution from the National Library of Australia. So I'd like to take this opportunity to touch on our role as a national institution and the challenges that lay ahead for us as we do indeed work to keep Australia's national memory alive. But first, if I may, acknowledgement of country. Naji Njimali, Namri, Gurmal, Wolgalu, Wallabaloa, Ngunnawal, Wiradjuri, Majigang Yanibu, Jaundu. My respects to the traditional owners of the lands of Canberra and its districts, the First Nations people of Ngambri, of Gurmal, Wolgalu, Wallabaloa, Ngunnawal, Wiradjuri, to their elders past and present. And also to acknowledge all First Nations Australians who are joining us today, and in particular acknowledge the presence of Mr. Paul House, a great friend of the National Archives, our cultural mentor, if I may say that, Paul, so Burul Malamang, proud Ngambri Wulgulu man. And also many other friends in the room. We've packed the room with good friendly people today, so it's good, Laura. I'm expecting an easy gig today. It should be pretty good. Members of the Diplomatic Corps, it's great to have your support here. Other national institutions as well. It's great to have you among us. Well, 60 years ago, in March 1961, in fact, the National Archives became an independent agency as a result, in fact, of the National Library establishing its own legislation. And its functions of the National Archives were then enacted in law in 1983. Of course, then we were known as the Commonwealth Archives Office, and then after a few name changes in 1998 became the National Archives of Australia. And today we continue to operate from leased premises in the National Triangle here in Canberra, alongside many of the other cultural icons in the nation's capital. And of course we have a public office in the capital city of every state and territory of Australia. Now, put simply, when I talk about the archives, the National Archives of Australia is the only Commonwealth government entity legislated with the task to ensure that the essential evidence of the actions and decisions of government are secured, preserved and made accessible. And so while I often collectively describe all of our institutions of libraries, archives, museums as memory institutions, I do believe that the Archives is the one institution truly dedicated to the preservation of memory. Now, I realise that view, coming from the Director-General of the National Archives, might sound a little bit precious, a little bit elitist, but it's not, and let me go on to explain why. Because it is about memory, it's about authentic memory. And if you think about memory, how memory is used, if we think about our personal memory, we are referring to our capacity to access and recall our first-hand experiences of the past. By recalling our memories, we're able to reach back into the past, we're able to re-observe the past and formulate a new understanding of what actually occurred and why. Based on that, we can then form an opinion that is not primarily based on other opinions, on someone else's view or interpretation, but we can form an opinion based on our own unobstructed view of the past. And that unobstructed view, unfiltered view of the past is the role of the archives. The primary purpose of the National Archives is not to keep secondary opinions, interpretations or souvenirs of the past, but instead to keep as far as possible the raw memory, the primary sources, the evidence. And sometimes these primary sources in our collection have never been referenced since the day they were created and are waiting in the archives to be rediscovered. So it's this unique aspect of archives that defines our principal role, to transmit Australia's memory from one generation to the next. At the National Archives of Australia, we don't profess to hold the accumulated knowledge or history or even the great achievements of humanity. That role is performed much more effectively and deliberately, can I say, by libraries, by museums, galleries and the other very important institutions. Each of our institutions is unique and complementary, and all are essential if we're going to have a civilised knowledge society in Australia. So, archives hold evidence of the past, the records of the activities, decisions and the events. And this affects the distinct way in which archives builds collection, again, which is fundamentally different to the way that libraries, museums and other institutions would gather their collections. So whereas a library or museum, and I appreciate there are librarians and museums in the room here today, but whereas other institutions might identify a gap, for example, in its holdings on a particular topic or a particular theme, often it's able to go out there and acquire some the best manuscripts, the best publications or some artefacts as exemplars or representatives of that particular subject. Memory institutions might accession items, deaccession unwanted or inferior items, curate the collection, publish, buy and sell, and in the process strengthen the value of that collection and the experiences that collection can offer. But archives and archival appraisal and selection of records is quite a different proposition. Within archives, especially government archives, collecting is much less like filling a gap or completing a set or even looking for the best of something. And in fact, it's much more akin to sweeping up evidence in a crime scene. Now, I'm not suggesting government activity is a crime scene, Laura. That's not the headline I'm after today, but if you think about gathering evidence, so the archivist attempts to find everything of relevance to a particular thing, an action, an event, a decision. And even though the full significance of the thing may not yet be understood, collecting records as evidence requires expertise, it requires judgment, it requires acute observation. But for archivists, it also requires objectivity and neutrality. It's gathering that record as evidence. And that evidence is the first step on a long process with an uncertain outcome. A single record in an archive may, in the end, be of vital importance. It may be trivial. It may be nothing more than a connection between two or more other records. Evidence is collected to serve the future. It is for the future to judge and determine if it is actually proof of anything, or indeed if it disproves a previously held belief. Evidentiary value is only maintained if it's collected, preserved and handled in the right way and to the highest standards. So it's not permissible in archives for anyone to see a bit of a gap in the collection and then dash out and buy something similar and plug it in to fit in the middle. It's got to maintain that chain of evidence. Thinking about archives, then, as memory, as evidence, helps non-archivists understand how and why we collect within archives. Again, we're not collecting any one thing for its own attributes, instead collecting a series of things as evidence and memory of something which is yet unseen. Now, of course, like every collecting institution, we do enjoy pulling out our more spectacular items in the collections. We do mount exhibitions to open up our collections or to tell a particular narrative of our history. But the archives will only ever exhibit a tiny fraction of the material that we hold, and in fact most of what we hold will never be exhibited. Again, the true value of an archival collection does not come from those single spectacular documents. It comes from the aggregation of documents and the relationships between them, and often those relationships do not become clear for a very long time. So this important differentiator, I think, establishes the National Archives as a national collecting institution, because we do not seek to keep records because we want to one day glorify our past, and we don't seek to collect records because one day we want to apologise for our past. government archives, the National Archives of Australia collects records to remember the past, faithfully, completely and honestly. As the Spanish philosopher Santayana famously said, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. If we are as a nation to truly remember the past accurately and objectively, then we cannot depend on just second-hand accounts or interpretations of published histories. To truly remember, to re-observe and to understand the events of the past, we must always return to the evidence and examine the primary sources, the records, the archives. And we must not forget that our national memory is not stuck in the past, it's a living memory. Now, we already have a staggering number of records in the National Archives collection, and of course it continues to grow as Australia itself grows. And I might say these are government records, the archives, but they're much more than sterile documents about bureaucratic processes in government offices. What makes the archives collection so fundamental to Australia's culture and our identity is that these records are, for the most part, about people. They're about famous people, they're about ordinary people, they're about immigrants, they're about Indigenous Australians. Because at various moments in our lives, all of us interact with some arm of government. And at that time, a record is kept. And within those records exist the personal stories of millions of Australians that collectively represent the memory of the nation. Within the collection, we have many millions of immigration records, documenting the name, the date of birth, the sex, the occupation and other details of individuals and entire families that have settled in Australia, or simply travelled abroad on a holiday, filling in one of those passenger cards, although it's digital these days, but we all leave a record that we now hold in the collection of the archives. Our military service files document the men and women that have served in all theatres of war, from the Boer War to present-day conflicts. Importantly, our memory of military service goes beyond the battlefields. We also have around 600,000 repatriation records, and these are the records that document the lives of the men and women who have returned from service and reveal the often heartbreaking stories of what those men and women of Australia had to endure as they returned to civilian life, still carrying the physical and mental effects of their experience of war. We hold Australia's secrets, and through our declassification program, make these available to the public. For example, our collection includes ASIO records that document covert investigations into persons of interest, including previously classified telecommunications intercept and secret surveillance footage. We hold the records of Australia's national broadcasters, the ABC and the SBS. So you can imagine the wealth of material within those holdings: interviews, photographs, recordings and film of so many Australians, holding the memory of our nation's evolving values and our lifestyles. But of course, keeping the records is not enough. Keeping the memory alive is more about just hanging on to stuff and hoarding it. Our responsibilities as archivists go much further than this. We have an obligation, a duty, to ensure that archives are promoted, made accessible and are used by everyone, anywhere and at any time. So this role of the National Archives, I think, also establishes us as a national institution that protects and sustains Australia's core national values. The success of our democracy in Australia relies upon the ability of all Australians to be informed about the decisions and actions of our government and its public officials. Were it not for the National Archives and the Archives Act, many records would be destroyed before they ever saw the light of day. And that would leave Australians more vulnerable to misinformation and disinformation that we know erodes public trust in government, poisons our system of democracy and would disenfranchise many Australians. The preservation of records as evidence is fundamental to ensure that Australians can access their rights and entitlements and receive equitable and fair treatment before the law. We're also well aware of emerging threats to our sovereignty as a nation, for example, our vulnerability to foreign interference and the extent to which it might undermine public debate in Australia and weaken our cultural identity. And mitigating that threat of foreign interference, for example, requires a national resilience built on a strong sense of who we are as a tolerant, diverse, multicultural society. And the National Archives is a resource for national resilience, giving all Australians the ability to engage in their own discovery, for truth-telling, and a constructive, informed reappraisal of our past. So, how are we doing? Are we succeeding? Where are we failing? And what lies ahead for the National Archives? Now, in 2019, the Attorney-General, then Christian Porter, also wanted answers to those questions. How is the National Archives going, fulfilling its national role? And the Attorney-General initiated an independent, functional and efficiency review of the National Archives to examine the purpose, the role, the functions, and recommend the appropriate level of resourcing that it should receive. The review, led by former Department of Finance Secretary Mr David Choon, AO, considered the powers, the functions, the resources, the governance frameworks that the National Archives does need to effectively and efficiently undertake its role in the digital age. More than 100 public submissions were received by the review, addressing all aspects of the institution. And a few of those who made submissions are here today, and I thank you. I see Peter Stanley over there, and I'm sure there are others in the room. We also have two members of our advisory council here as well, who made three? Ah, hello, Chris, sorry, jeez. That's going to cost me, I'll tell you that. 3 members of our advisory council also were very active participants in that review and made very persuasive submissions. So that was really gratifying. Mr Choon, in doing the review, also consulted internationally, comparing our strategies and our operations with the National Archives of the USA and of the United Kingdom. The report was publicly released in March this year, and then in July this year, the Attorney-General, Michaelia Cash, and Assistant Minister to the Attorney-General, Amanda Stoker, jointly announced a funding package of $67.7 million to address the immediate issues identified in the report. The release of the Choon Review also, of course, generated a great deal of media attention. And for a time, it did elevate the National Archives to a national conversation. Behind the scenes, a great deal of work was done at the ministerial level, particularly by the office of our Assistant Minister, Amanda Stoker, to secure a substantial funding package for the archives at a time where the financial resources of the Australian government are being stretched by the pressures of the pandemic. I also welcome Justin McGovern here from the Minister's office, who was one of those people working very, very strenuously behind the scenes for that. And of course, we received a great deal of public support. And we responded to that public support by opening channels for people to participate in the work that we do, either through donations, which we're overwhelmed with the level of donations that we received, and an expansion of the Archives membership program, also very gratifying. Now, the recommendations of the Choon Review and the funding announced by the government are now going to see improvements across a number of areas for us. One, it's going to go into accelerating the release of previously classified government records. It's going to help us address the preservation of some of our most at-risk records. It will improve the cyber security for the nationally sensitive records in our care, and also allow us to achieve efficiencies through the greater digitisation of the records themselves, but digitisation of the public services that we provide. And so, especially because I am here at the National Press Club, I might, just in a few moments left to me, focus on a couple of those areas in particular. Just to address, I think, public access, which is always a major issue, and of course some of the challenges around digital preservation. So, on access. Now, last year, the National Archives received 47,000 applications to open previously closed files, 47,000. So I was looking around 1,000 a week almost coming in. Now, responding to those requests for access to a government record is not a simple process. It is not as easy as grabbing a file off a shelf, taking it out the front and handing it over. What differentiates the National Archives and the collection of government records from example, for a public library, for example, is that when records are transferred to the National Archives, in almost every case they are a secret. They are closed. Now, our default position is after 20 years, that then becomes available for public access. But however, the legislation requires that prior to doing that, we have to test it to make sure no exemptions continue to apply, and I'll just explain those in a moment. So when a request comes into the archives, we don't sort of say, yes, you can have that, or no, you can't have that, based on a whim. or we don't sort of assess the worthiness of who you are as a historian or the worthiness of your request. You know, we are absolutely agnostic about anything to do with the reason that the request is being made. So as we're concerned, they are all public records. Everyone has a right under the Act to access a public record. But the release of the records is controlled by legislation, that is the Archives Act. The legislation prescribes a default position to open records after 20 years. However, it also prescribes strict exemptions, which do require us to hold back some of the more sensitive records from public release until those sensitivities have diminished. All of those records are records that rightfully attract public interest. It's not a public interest test, you know, and I keep reiterating that. You know, they are public records. We wouldn't be preserving them unless they were destined for release one day. But again, we're obliged by law to carefully balance issues of national security, international relations, personal privacy and commitments of confidentiality made with some depositors. Now, we do come under constant fire for the decisions we make, and I'm expecting some more today. I'm hoping there'll be some more today. And that's good, and that's as it should be in Australia. You know, we should be accountable for those decisions. And most notably, we have to do a lot of explaining about why it takes so long, and I'm very happy to talk about that in a moment. But I do stress that the default is always to release records to the public and to share them for the public good. But we will always do that lawfully and responsibly. And there are other sort of angles on this. Take, for example, the many records that we hold about First Nations Australians. Now, some of those records may be freely shared, while others require community or individual consultation or consent. Then there are those records that contain sacred knowledge, which can only be appropriately shared among a few. Now, we may be objective collectors of our nation's memories good, bad, interesting and innocuous, but we must be conscientious about what we share publicly, whether it is for cultural reasons or reasons of national personal security. And so if we do look at foreign policy, and again acknowledging members of the diplomatic corps here today, you might be interested in this. Foreign policy, security and intelligence records must also be carefully tested for exemptions which are specified in the Act. So the Act exempts release of information that might damage our foreign relations, that might erode the trust between Australia and Australia's friends and allies, or that might weaken our national security. Now, I understand that in the public's view, the value of the National Archives is not in the secrets that we keep. The value of the National Archives is the information we release. And again, that's perfectly understandable and as it should be. However, the legislation does recognise that harm can be done by irresponsibly revealing secrets that should be kept. Now, you know, you may think and this is also commented on from time to time, this is my previous employment with ASIO speaking here, but I assure you it is not. It comes from a place of compassion, responsibility and respect for the law. And speaking to the Press Club as journalists, I think, if you'll forgive me, I'm not a journalist, but if you allow me this indulgence, I think journalists always exhibit that if you want to maintain the public's trust, if you want to keep doing what you do in revealing the stories that need to be told, then you must protect your sources and methods and uphold a lawful and ethical code. That the two things go, you know, with making things public comes the responsibility to keep some things close. So the work of our declassification programs is sensitive, it's highly specialised and it's labour intensive. And you know, while our statistics demonstrate that we do work as hard as we can to release information, and in fact 98.5% of all documents released are released without a single redaction. So you know, we're talking about 1.5% which attract some redaction or wholly exempt. So you know, that statistically we are a pro-disclosure organisation. However, I am quite receptive to copying criticism that it can take a long time to do that, and I think that's a valid criticism. Because, as I say, it takes a long time to clear the 47,000 requests that we get each year. Each one of those requests might involve hundreds of records, you know, within that request. However, the good news today is that I'm very pleased to advise that recent funding announcement by the Attorney-General and the Assistant Minister has included a measure for us to employ more staff and to apply smarter technology to this task, and I really hope to see a dramatic improvement in those processing times. The other thing I wanted to talk about was preservation of the collection. Now, our collection, as I've said, already includes hundreds of millions of records in physical form. We have papers, we have photographs, we have films, audio recordings. We measure in shelf kilometres in the archives. So if you can imagine this, we have 360 shelf kilometres of records lined up in boxes, which are our analogue collection in physical form. In digital form, of course, we've been accumulating digital archives for some time now, and we currently have over 5 petabytes in our collection, and more to come, obviously. And as government interactions, as the business of government becomes more and more digital, then of course the records are all being digital, and the work of the archives is also digital. And this digital transition is something that we've been preparing for, and in fact responding to for quite some time, certainly since I commenced in the role back in 2012. Over the last 10 years or so, we've led the reform of information management policy and standards in accordance with the government's digital transformation agenda. We introduced the digital transition policy back in 2011, mandating that if government creates a record digitally, it has to be kept digitally, maintained digitally, archived digitally. Because if you don't, if you print it off and put it on a paper file, you lose that chain of evidence. 2015, we launched our digital continuity policy, which was really focused on providing a set of policies across government to strengthen information governance and interoperability of government records and government record keeping. We also published the Information Management Standard in 2017. So all of these instruments provide simple, clear principles and implementation pathways to assist the digital transformation of government towards a digital business as usual. And thanks again to the recent government funding boost, we are going to continue this transformation over the next 4 years. We'll be scaling up activities to digitise and preserve the physical collection with a focus on our most at-risk records first. And we're also looking at revising our enabling legislation, the Archives Act, to become more of a modern piece of legislation fit for the digital age. We'll be scaling up our cybersecurity, our digital archive that will enable new ways to access, use and interrogate the collection. And I do want to make a comment. As our collection becomes increasingly digital, as I say, we're moving towards digital delivery of services. And as we've been announcing and talking through these strategies, I know that there has been some concern across our clientele, if you like, across Australia, that with digitisation, with automation, comes a closure of some of our offices. As I said earlier on, we're quite proud of the fact that we have an office, a public office, in every state and territory capital of Australia. And can I just categorically say that we are not closing any of our offices around Australia. Of course, we will be digitising the records, but as the staff of the National Archives are not placed where we are around Australia because of the records that happen to reside there, we're placed in every part of Australia because of the Australians that live there. Our focus is on public service. We face the public, and we will continue to face the public in all of those locations, providing face-to-face services for and into the future. Earlier, I also expressed how significant the recent public support has been for the archives. It was also, for me, quite personally significant. As a strong believer in the role that we have and the value it has for the Australian public, it was really rewarding for myself and all of the people at the National Archives to really see the growing the value that it has for the Australian public and the strong commitment of all Australians to keeping Australia's national memory alive. And that hasn't just been the very generous donations that have come forward and the incredible growth in the number of people signing up as members of our institution, although we'll continue to willingly receive that support in the future. But it was also the expression of public sentiment towards protecting our memories and keeping them alive, intact and authentic for generations to come. People who didn't know what we did now do know, and that's largely thanks to the media. And I see Shane Wright sitting over there, and I was saying, I was quite grateful for the explanations of the functions of the archives and the importance that it has. Really did come through quite strongly in those stories that were published through the media. So I'm quite grateful for that. But the story of the archives is also, being told by people in all walks of life who have approached us, who have expressed their support and their views, and are sharing our story of what we are and what we do, both at home and abroad. And it is a story, I think, as a national memory institution that does touch millions of lives, not just in Australia, but worldwide, reminding us of the value of remembering the road we've travelled when considering the path that we'll take. And although we're sharing today the National Archives story, the real story is, and always will be, the story of Australia. The story being written every day by the records of government that we preserve. The records that become part of Australia's shared memory, our collective memory, our community memory, the national memory. Woodaga Woody, thank you. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, David. Yes, you can stay there, and the fun bit starts. Just a couple of questions to start with, which go to the history of the archives over the last 20 or 30 years and about the nature of government. One of them is we've now had several decades of the Freedom of Information Act, and it's often commented that it's actually had a perverse effect of tending to mean that governments don't actually write a lot of stuff down that they might have previously recorded. And I just wondered whether you're in a position to reflect on that. And similarly, for the last 20 years, since the Twin Towers incident and the upsurge of interest in national security, plus cyber security issues, is a much more, well, you know, the crass way of saying it would be much greater paranoia about what is released. I was just wondering if you could reflect on how both of those trends affect the way you may make decisions and the sort of nature of the records of what government does.
Yeah. Yes, and they do. I mean, these are the mega trends in government information policy. I think it's and as you do say FOI, I do. When I talk to roomfuls of public servants, I really do try and discourage this negative feeling towards FOI, because I think that if public servants are working professionally, if they're working ethically, if they're doing the job that they've been told to do by government and by law, then we should be proud of the work that we've done. And public servants in the Commonwealth should really accept the idea that we are every day making history as well. We're not only just delivering on functions and delivering services. Like right now in the COVID pandemic, across government, we're not only working flat out to do the COVID response, but we're making history. And this is history that Australia needs to remember. We need to learn from this because there will be another pandemic. And so I think, this whole thing about FOI having a chilling effect and saying, oh, better not write that down, or let's do that by phone or whatever. I do think there is that. I think there's a bit of a complacency about the importance, the long-term value of the work we do within the agencies of government as knowledge and learning for this nation, as opposed to being frightened that this email might sort of somehow embarrass me or whatever. So, look, I do think there is that, and I mentioned our information management standard. I mentioned all of the things we do in the archives is to encourage, as a matter of professional pride, that people do make records of what they do. And it's also an obligation for the future to do that. The other thing about FOI, I always try and remind people that there's this kind of visceral fear that, everything will be released. But the FOI legislation also has exemptions, because the business of government requires confidentiality. All of us in our personal lives, in our professional lives, we know what has to be kept, confidential. If someone shares a secret with you, then you need to maintain their confidence. We need confidentiality. So it's about culture, it's about explaining that to people. I think with the trend of, after September 11, it's 20 years ago now. We can't talk about it like a recent event anymore. But it's, with the explosion, I suppose, in very high-profile work of security and intelligence, and the growth in the number of records that have been created around that, I think maybe there's been a feeling that we've tightened up on the release of those records. I don't think that is the case. I think that it's just more front of mind for Australians, that Australians want to know more. We want to be more enfranchised with what's going on in Australia. We want to know more about what's going on, and we want to have a better informed public debate. So I think demand has gone way up, but I think on the supply side, if I can use those terms, I don't think there is a trend towards more secrecy. It is just that there's a lot more going on, or it feels that way, and because we have opened up, and here I am today, advertising these channels to access those records. And I mentioned the overwhelming demand we have. So, look, I do, Australia is best served by ensuring everything that can be made public is made public, but Australia's future will be severely undermined if we are reckless about the way that information is given out. And as I say, again, mindful of our diplomatic representatives in the room, Australia's got many trusted relationships with other states, and we need that. That's the future of our country as well, so we have to respect that.
Shane Wright has a question.
Dr. Fricker, thanks for your speech today. The National Archives was actually mentioned in the Auditor General's report into the Commuter Car Park Fund, and you've mentioned the Digital 2015 program, and it was found that the Infrastructure Department just doesn't really know how it's keeping its details in regard to a very contentious political fund. I'm just wondering, in terms of the Tune Review, one of the suggestions is that the archives will actually have to have people based in departments to give that advice. How is that going to be practical? That seems a large number of an army of archivists, which you might be happy with. I'm not sure if everyone will be. Having to go in and really give that real-time advice. How important, as part of Tune, do you think that will be, and getting departments to understand how to properly archive something?
Yep, look, thanks, Shane. And it is, yes, it's very important. Look, every audit report, and I do read every audit report, every Royal Commission. There's going to be a section in there about record keeping. How is it so hard to find the records of what actually happened here? Where's the evidence, as I kept saying? And so there's always more work to be done. And as we embrace more and more digital technology across government, we're enjoying all of the benefits of personal devices and it's very easy technology, but that can bring about some complacency about where the record is being kept. Record on WhatsApp or a record on Facebook, they're not Commonwealth government systems, so how are we going to capture that and keep that in a government record-keeping system? So David Tune's recommendation there was quite ambitious, and it was about if the National Archives could take overall responsibility for records management across government, and that would be, it's revenue neutral, it would be about transferring staff in those areas across onto the archives books, and they would become part of the army of National Archives records management police that would ensure that we're all doing the right thing. Now that is very ambitious, but in the near term, and again, the funding announcement at the beginning of July has a measure in there for outreach teams for the National Archives. So there is now more funding for us to do exactly what you're referring to proactively go out to the government agencies across the Commonwealth, provide some assistance, advice and support to strengthen up, to bolster up the record-keeping processes and culture, really, within those organisations. Not doing it the hard way, taking advantage of technology. This is not about, every Friday afternoon do your record-keeping and the rest of the week do your real work. This is about baking in to all of our digital processes proper information management. So that, so we have some good news on the near horizon to actually do that. But again, I don't underestimate the scale of the effort required, because you're right, every audit report you ever read is going to have something about you should have kept better records.
Andrew Tillett.
Andrew Tillett from the Financial Review and Director here at the Press Club. Thanks for your speech, Dr. Fricker. Your friends across the lake, the War Memorial, have been given $500 million for expansion projects there, which a lot of people aren't happy about. You guys had to fight tooth and nail to get your $67 million increase. We have a situation where different institutions, the Old Parliament House, the National Library, you all respond to different sort of ministers. There's no sort of minister in charge of, the nation's history as such. I just wonder if you feel like at times that the various institutions are sort of pitted against each other for government funding, and more broadly, whether philosophically government, not the current government, but government in general, doesn't pay enough attention, I guess, to its responsibility as sort of like, someone who can facilitate the telling of the Australian story.
Well, look, so first of all, there's not a race, about, every Monday morning we get together in the institutions, okay, how's, a leaderboard or anything like that. I mean, any investment in the cultural identity and the national memory of Australia is welcome. We should all rejoice in that, honestly. And so, in terms of how we work together, I mean, right now there is a high level of collaboration going on. And in fact, again, related to this funding boost for us, there is also work going on behind the scenes to make sure that whatever we're doing is compatible with the digital infrastructure that is being invested in across all of the cultural institutions in the Commonwealth. So there is a high level of collaboration, of partnership. I think Nancy Ayres is here today from the Film and Sound Archive, for example. So we are right now engaged very deeply in collaboration, because at the Film and Sound Archive, at the National Archive, we share a problem around the digitisation of magnetic tape, audiovisual heritage. It makes sense for us to work together, and we do that. So it really is in a very non-competitive environment we do these things. And it's not a zero-sum game, I don't think, in that respect. It is about making proper, shrewd, well-developed investment decisions. But again, as I said in my speech, all of us have complementary roles. Australia is enriched by the War Memorial, it's enriched by the National Library, it's enriched by the Film and Sound Archive, and it's enriched by the National Archives, because it's all about, who we are as a nation. It's what we know about ourselves. If Australia needs to read books, we need a library so that we can read books. But Australia needs to write books, and so you need an archive so that people can also write new books. So, it all works together. So really, that's the way that it is, and it does befall to us, I think, in these financially stretched times, to make sure that across all the cultural institutions, every dollar we invest is not being duplicated, and is not being used in a competitive way across that. But it's all about the public and delivering our cultural heritage to the Australian public. Thanks.
Just while Andrew Green's making his way up to the microphone, just as a follow-up, is there a case for the archives to be much more clearly a servant of the Parliament rather than the government?
Yeah, look, that's an interesting one. That goes to separation of powers in some way, because the legislation around the National Archives is very deliberately, we keep the records of the executive. So the Parliament has its own regime for how it keeps its records. The courts also have their own regime. So it does relate very, very closely to that separation of powers. And so our function is to make sure that the evidence of the executive has been maintained and kept authentic and is at the right time made available to the public.
Dr. Fricker, I'd like to take you...
Hang on, look, Andrew, I've got to stop. I'm very flattered by this, but my brother is Dr. Fricker, but I'm not. But by all means, if it keeps going, though, I'll be an honorary doctor at some point. But
I'll call myself Professor Green.
That's right, good.
Mr. Fricker, I'll take you back to your comments on declassifying and your insistence that the archive's default position is not to keep things secret. Mm-hmm. I will refer also to some recent court action. We've seen in the Administrative Appeals Tribunal your organisation spend tens of thousands of dollars fighting the public release of documents which are 50 years old. Yep. In the United States, we've seen equivalent documents declassified by the Clinton administration, for example, the Chile declassification project. If we look at the records of our overseas intelligence agency and the overthrow of the regime in Chile, that one is being fought by your organisation. Similarly, with East Timor records, there was $132,000 spent by the archives. Can you give an assurance that it isn't the former ASIO boss or 2IC actively fighting for the release of very historic records that many would argue are in the national interest?
Yeah. No, look, thank you. And look, it's a very good question, as we say, because it is something that occupies a lot of my time and a lot of our time in the organisation. And look, it's not, I know it's easy to say we spent that much money fighting access. And I don't know, it just sounds like spin, but we're not fighting access. What we're doing is we're being publicly accountable for those decisions. Because even though we spend all that money in the tribunals, if the tribunal upholds the decision as a lawful, properly made lawful. We still have spent that much money. Now that was not money spent fighting access. If the tribunal says, well, actually, that's the lawful thing to do. That's money we spent demonstrating to the public that we are behaving in a lawful, responsible way. You know, that's the cost of justice in Australia. Now, if we, you know, I can't ever be in like with the Palace letters, for example. So much publicised amount that was expended on legal fees around the Palace letters is 1.5, maybe just under $1.6 million in total. Now, at every point along the way, so if the federal court says, no, these are not government records, these are personal private records, then I can't the next day go out and say, oh, the federal court said that, but guess what? You know, I'm going to release it because I happen to like the historian, I think it's an interesting story. I can't. And then the full bench of the federal court on appeal then says, no, these are government records, you know, they're not personal private records. Again, at that point, I can't then say, well, look, this is costing a lot, how about I ignore what the federal court says, the full bench of the federal court, and I release them. And it's rightly, it goes to the High Court. The High Court made a different ruling. Good, I release them.
So you speak regularly with your counterparts around the world. Do we have a problem in Australia with secrecy where, for instance, in defence circles, we often learn about what our own military is doing through the Americans?
Yeah, look, and honestly, a lot of that is anecdotal. It will happen from time to time, and when it does happen, we adjust our parameters here. When it happens to them, they adjust their parameters over there. Obviously, we're not going to withhold information which we know has been made public by another institution or an agency somewhere else in the world. But look, in terms of how, and this is all in the legislation here, right? It's what the Parliament passed and is enacted as legislation. But most archives in the world, like you go to the UK, they don't declassify records. The only thing which is deposited in the archives are the things which have been released by MI5 or by the Ministry of Defence or these other things. So when you go to the archives, you know that it's all released. It's now in America they do have a declassification program there, but it's very few actually. Australia is one of the very relatively minor number of countries that does have the regime that we have. We have an organisation like ours, which is not the ministry that created the records, having an objective view. And in fact, can I tell you, we fight for access. We never fight against access. We are the ones advocating inside the system to make sure that 98.5% of those documents are released to the public. So, you know, the publicity will always be centred around those few documents that are redacted or are withheld. And I think it's quite right, you know, that we should be taken to the tribunal and stand up and account for those decisions, and we should have those legally challenged, forensically challenged. That's expensive. But it's the price of accountability. And I don't think there's any argument to say that we should be saving money on legal expenditure by simply ignoring the law and ignoring the rulings of courts and just giving stuff out all over the place. Therein lies some serious damage for Australia's interests. Thank you.
This seems an appropriate opportunity. We did ask for some invited questions today, and one of them was from Professor Jenny Hocking of Monash University.
Oh, Jenny.
She says, last year the High Court ruled against the archives in my legal action seeking the release of the Palace letters, and the court awarded all costs against the archives. The archives then released the letters. As a result, you've said the archives will also release the letters between other Governors-General from Lord Casey to Sir William Dean, although they have not yet been released. The High Court's decision definitively ended the Queen's embargo over such letters, yet you have just revealed to Parliament that the Queen is still involved in the archive's decisions about their release. Given your comprehensive loss at the High Court, why are you continuing to allow the Queen to be involved in any way, directly or indirectly, in decisions regarding our own history?
Yeah, so look, there's parts of that which are true, so let me acknowledge that. So yeah, no, the High Court, absolutely, that High Court decision was very, very important. And as I said at the time, I congratulated Jenny on actually fighting that way thing, you know, all the way to the High Court and achieving that outcome. And we have responded, you know, very quickly with the Kerr letters, which we'd had far more time to analyse and go over, release them without any redaction. And it's absolutely right as well. I did say at the time, straight after the High Court decision, that now meant the other letters that we had are indeed Commonwealth records, subject to those access provisions. Now, again, this comes down to the time, but these are more than just the letters of one Governor-General over a short 5-year period. These are the letters over several decades of Governors-General on a whole range of topics, which is taking us some time to go through, to analyse, to examine, but we are still, it's absolutely clear, we are working towards a release of those records pursuant to all of the exemptions that I've just talked about in the Archives Act. And we're committed to that. You know, I keep saying this, we are a pro-disclosure organisation, but the rule book is the legislation. I can't, it's like telling the Olyroos, you know, you could score more goals if you had 15 players on the field. You know, they can't do that. You know, there are rules, and I have rules as well, but it's legislation. So we are doing it, we're working as hard as we can. Again, as I've said, the funding announcement of government is going to assist that because it's really channeling more resources into that activity. And, you know, we are working hard on releasing the next tranche of those Governor-General letters.
Doug Dingwall.
Doug Dingwall from the Canberra Times. Thank you for your address, Mr. Fricker. Today you've touched on it, and previously you've raised concerns about the failure of the Archives Act to cover encrypted messages, with the effect that WhatsApp messages, signal messages between ministerial officers and public servants might not be captured. Can you tell us about the gaps in record keeping, and do they extend beyond these encrypted messages? What kind of reform is needed to the Act to address this, and to what extent is it on public servants to push back against this practice to make sure that there's effective record keeping?
All right. No, thank you. Look, I think it is a big issue for government record keeping that, you know, the pace of government in the digital age is just extraordinary. And, you know, like and it should be. You know, I love technology, and I think that we should be adopting emerging technology. It makes us more efficient, more productive, etc. But the legislation also needs to keep pace. We need to move legislation with technology, and we are. You know, we are, again, working on this across the portfolio with our portfolio department, Attorney General's Department and the Minister's Office on modernising the legislation. And the problem here is that and it relates to the High Court decision actually, there's a very kind of interesting definition of a Commonwealth record in the legislation that says it's a record that is the property of the Commonwealth. And it was never about, you know, the High Court case, it wasn't actually about the Queen's embargo, it was about whose property was this. It was a legal argument about property. And here again, you know, it starts, so whose property is a Facebook entry? You know, whose property is WhatsApp? You know, so if I send a WhatsApp message about government business, about my duties as a public official, it's not, is it the property of the Commonwealth? Because it's on WhatsApp, and I'm not sure if the Commonwealth can claim property on that. So we do need to modernise legislation, because if we're going to efficiently capture the evidence of government activity, we need to have legislation that properly embraces those non-government platforms. Now, what we're doing about it in the near term, as well as, you know, carefully going through changes to the legislation, but we are promoting, you know, promulgating standards which are under the Public Service Act, under the PSPF Act, you know, these pieces of legislation that govern the way public servants work. You know, there is a duty, there's an obligation in there to maintain a proper level of records of what's been done. So right now it's saying, well, if you are doing business on WhatsApp or text messages or Facebook or whatever, you also need to keep a record of that. You need to grab that somehow, either screen scrape the thing if you need to, or otherwise have some sort of software that brings that into a government record keeping system. So very long answer but I think it's a really important question. And, you know, again, it's in the digital age, what constitutes evidence of government activity.
And is it on public servants to push back on that practice as well?
Is it what? Sorry?
Is it on public servants to push back on that practice as well in using encrypted messaging in their communications with government?
Look, the encryption, it's for me, it's not so much about the encryption. We can deal with the encryption part of it, although, you know, we'd have to do it because we want to be able to access these records 20 years from now. So if they're encrypted, we need to know we can decrypt them, you know, 20 years from now. So we are dealing with that as an aspect of digital preservation. But it is, yes, it's right now it's an obligation on public servants as their professional duty, as their, you know, public service values to be accountable and ethical and all those other things, to make sure that they have kept adequate records of the work that they've done. Yep, thank you.
James Elton.
Mr. Fricker, James Elton from 730. I want to ask you about the at-risk records, and specifically, I think maybe the magnetic tape, given that there is this deadline looming in 2025, and maybe even sooner for some tape formats when we'll just lose it. And when you first spoke to our program about this about 2 years ago, there were 130,000 hours. I think it's now about 110, 115.
Yep.
My question is about priorities, because we are going to have to make some hard choices here. We're going to lose some. And so I suppose the question is, how do you guarantee to the people that those priorities are going to be right, that the people who are making those decisions are making them in the right way? And I just draw your attention to some of the previous money that's come from government that's been earmarked for this purpose was set aside for World War II records. $10 million, I think that was. In the more recent response to the Tune Review, they mentioned some more recent conflicts and military records from wars like Vietnam. And some people might say, well, that's politicisation, you know? War records aren't more important than anything else. So how do you prioritise, especially in a circumstance where you may not know what's in every box?
Yeah. No, thank you. And look, it's so a lot of it's around significance assessment. I mean, well, first of all, with this amount of money, I think we've got now, it's not such a sort of a Sophie's choice, you know, sort of moment for us. We can actually now plan and schedule. And a lot of this stuff, you know, we outsource this stuff, so we do not try and digitise all of that volume of magnetic tape on our own premises with our own equipment. So by reaching out to industry and all of the suppliers who are qualified and able to work with us on this, we're able to spread that load. And so over the 4-year period, I'm now very confident that we are going to be, you know, we are on top of this issue of mag tape. But to the prioritisation, look, for us there is, if we do have to make choices about what is, you know, considered more at risk and less, then it is around significance assessment. So it is about, you know, is this is this something that does uniquely document a particular aspect of Australian government or Australian life? You know, how fragile is, you know, can we, because we keep this stuff at low temperatures, can we freeze, can we stabilise this for a bit longer than these other roles, etc. And from that we do, you know, your question about the politicisation, you know, I was mentioning earlier that the role of the archivist is to be neutral and objective about these things. Now, of course, we're all human beings. We all bring to the job of archiving our own personal values and all the rest of it. But as within the National Archives, it's really a professional requirement to remove that and really think about this in terms of its archival value. So our appraisal is around that sort of significance of these things, its uniqueness, its you know, the volume of information which it does document, how fragile is it, you know, what the formats are, etc. And also, is Australian industry ready right now to digitise that particular format, in which case we'll take advantage of that. Because that's the other thing about deadline 2025. 10 years from now, those businesses might not still be operating because there won't be enough business in mag tape to keep them afloat. So it is. So look, you know, I think it's again a really good question. But it's not about politicising. It's not about, you know, preserving the stuff that sounds interesting today, because today we're talking about COVID or we're talking about, you know, whatever it might be. It's stuff that is legitimately, genuinely of importance for the future of Australia's understanding of who we are. Thank you.
Mark Kenny.
Mark Kenny, Mr. Fricker from the National...
I'm missing doctor now. I'm already starting to regret. I'm regretting that I said...
You reflected a bit on the legislation, on some of the strictures that were on you in relation to the palace letters, for example. I wonder if you could reflect on the legislation more broadly, not just in terms of, I mean, for example, you addressed the question of the new technologies and those challenges that presents, but is it time for changes to the Act that would give you greater freedom in relation to the releasing of information? As you say, you're operating within the law, but does the law need changing?
Thank you for that. I think the law does need changing, but I would probably say that about any piece of legislation that was written in the 1970s, as our legislation was. It's been tinkered with a bit over the years, but it really was drafted during the 70s, and nobody was contemplating the internet, let alone WhatsApp, you know, these things. And so I think it does need to be brought up to date, and it's also for the Australian public to have a clear expression of what it means, you know, a language that all Australians can understand. And it might sort of keep us away from the courts and the tribunals. So I wouldn't be after any more freedom per se. I just want to have a clearer statement of the intent. of the Parliament, ultimately, on what should be made public and what should be kept secret and for why, and for that to be clearly articulated. And I think, the High Court case was a good example of this. Why did it take so long to settle, the legal status of those records? Surely something like that could have been resolved in 5 minutes, but it wasn't. Why do the judges of the Federal Court and the High Court disagree with each other over something that should be just a simple binary reading of a line of legislation? But it isn't. And it costs a lot of money, but again, I'm not complaining, it's the price of justice. But they're the sorts of things that we really should clean up. In 2021, I think for public records, for Australians to understand what is public access they're entitled to, and also for Australians to understand how much their secrets and their privacy will be kept. Because remember, as I said, these records are about they're about you and me, and we don't want necessarily our private information to be released to the first person that comes along to the archives and wants to write a tell-all biography about you, for example. So we've got to protect. Governments are obliged to be accountable, but individuals are entitled to privacy. And we just need legislation that clearly articulates that and spells it out. And again, with the other things around what is a Commonwealth record in the digital age, we need more nuanced legislation around the records of First Nations Australians. To release a record at the moment under the Act is very binary. It's either in the public or it's not. It's very hard to make a release available to a certain community within Australia that reflects, those sort of cultural norms and restrict access to another community under the current Act. And I think Australia is a multicultural nation, is someone who's, much further down the path, I hope, on reconciliation. These are the sorts of things we could have in the Act. But for me, mainly, it's about, the discussions we're having about why don't you releasing that and why are you being so secretive. It'd be great if the legislation could just spell that out very clearly to give everyone certainty about what the rules are.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our final question is from Simon Gross.
Simon Gross from Canberra. My question is about your external funding. When the debate was on about the extra funding that has now been delivered, I remember Minister Stoker raised the idea of philanthropic support and got a bit of a hard time over that. I went into your website, there's a tab partnerships. I thought, okay, they might have partnerships, and all the partnerships are with overseas counterparts. You don't have any statement about external funding, but you talked tonight at a day about donations. So accept donations. What's your policy on external funding, and to what proportion of your funding would be external?
So look, these are early days for us. It's the archives as an institution, like the other cultural institutions. We're a deductible gift recipient. We have been for some time. But obviously in this recent media attention, that has really come to the light, and we have seen people coming forward and giving us donations, which is great. So our policy is that we would welcome philanthropy, we welcome donations to undertake those core functions that we have. And right now we're focused on preservation of at-risk records, and so we've, if you like, quarantined those donated funds to address specific records that urgently need preservation treatment. And that would be the things that we can do above and beyond what we're now able to do with the government funding. The policy really is around maintaining our ethical and legal position, because we're a non-corporate government entity. That is, we are an executive agency of the government, and so it would be difficult for us, for example, to enter into a partnership with a business enterprise that was also, lobbying for a certain government policy to be made or something, and might sort of be inclined to sort of influence our sort of directions about what records should be kept or not be kept, because we have that regulatory role as well. So while we have partnerships which are absolutely mutual with our objectives and our role as an executive agency of government, we would welcome those funds. It is a recommendation of the Tune Review, and we are pursuing those, and we're welcoming those now. But for me, the main policy there is that we enter into partnerships which do not call into question the independence and authority of the National Archives as the keeper of the evidence of the executive.
And external funding, what percentage roughly? Do you got an idea?
Right, in terms of a target?
No, not a target, but now.
Oh, now it's very low, and so you know.
5%?
Oh, no, it's much less than that. So an approach of about 70 million. You know, we earn our own revenue through selling copies of records and things like that. That might be worth a couple of million. The donations we've received to date of just over $1 million, and so it's much lower.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Mr. Dr. Professor, the Honourable David Fricker.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.